The Filipino sun was setting over Manila, painting the sky with orange hues as Manny Pacquiao drove his car after a long day of political commitments. He had become a respected senator following his illustrious boxing career, but always maintained contact with his roots, frequently passing through the capital's humbler neighborhoods. Heavy traffic forced him to take a detour under the Bonifacio overpass, an area on the outskirts of Manila, known for sheltering homeless people, a constant reminder of the inequalities he tried to fight in his political career. As the vehicle slowly advanced, something caught Manny's attention through the window. A middle-aged man, thin and scarred, sitting on a piece of cardboard, staring fixedly at the horizon, with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 defeats. There was something strangely familiar about that face marked by time and hardship, something that transported Manny back to his glory days in the ring. The former world champion's heart raced when the realization hit him like a right hook. That man was Eduardo "Eagle" Marasigan, one of his first and most formidable opponents from the beginning of his career. Manny felt a lump in his throat, remembering his last fight against Marasigan almost 20 years ago, when they were both young fighters hungry for recognition in the Philippines. Eduardo had been a promising boxer, with quick reflexes and a powerful jab. Respected for his technique and sportsmanship, the bout between them had been intense, with Manny winning on points in a controversial decision that many believed should have favored Marasigan, a victory that helped catapult Pacquiao's career, while Eduardo slowly disappeared from the boxing scene. Without hesitation, Manny instructed his driver to stop the car, ignoring his advisor's protests about the appointments he still had that evening. Something more important than any political meeting was calling him: a debt from the past, a necessary acknowledgement, a chance to understand what had happened to someone who, in another reality, could have followed the same path of success as he had. The distance between their current lives seemed like a cruel abyss of fate, a lottery that Manny had won and Eduardo had lost. The former champion stepped out of the car, feeling Manila's humid air on his skin, while his security guard tried to dissuade him from approaching the potentially dangerous area. Manny ignored the warnings, walking determinedly toward the man who, ironically, years ago, had tried to prevent him from achieving glory in the ring, and now could barely sustain his own gaze, lost in thoughts that seemed too distant to be reached. Eduardo didn't recognize Manny immediately. His eyes were blurred not only by age, but also by the difficulties he faced daily to survive on Manila's streets. When he finally looked up and saw his former rival standing before him, a mixture of shame and pride crossed his life-worn face. Pacquiao sat beside him on the improvised cardboard, completely ignoring the contrast between his impeccable suit and the dirt of the place, a silent gesture that said much about the man he had become, beyond titles and riches. The following hours passed like minutes as Eduardo, hesitant at first, began to share his story. Before facing Manny, Eduardo "Eagle" Marasigan had been a rising promise in Mindanao, far from Manila's centralized spotlight. From the small province of Zamboanga del Sur, his 17 victorious fights, 14 by knockout, had earned him regional recognition, but the lack of media coverage in peripheral provinces kept him as a semi-hidden talent on the national scene. The son of a fisherman and a market vendor, Eduardo had found in boxing not just a passion but an escape route from the endemic poverty that plagued his community. After his defeat to Manny, his career was abruptly interrupted, not so much by the loss itself, but by an injury to his right eye that was neglected by profit-hungry promoters. The partial retinal detachment he suffered during that fight was diagnosed late, when he had already fought 2 more times, irreparably aggravating his condition. Without adequate support and resources for specialized medical treatment, Eduardo tried to continue fighting with compromised vision, resulting in consecutive defeats and eventually a medical ban that permanently removed him from professional rings when he was only 28 years old. While Pacquiao rose to worldwide fame, Eduardo disappeared into the obscure corners of the sport, a common fate for many Filipino boxers without connections in Manila. With boxing out of reach, Eduardo tried various jobs, working as a security guard, instructor in local gyms, and even as a fisherman in the province of Sama, his homeland. His wife Ligaya stood by him for years, but constant poverty and limited opportunities took their toll on the relationship. The deep depression that followed the end of his career led Eduardo to temporary alcoholism, aggravating his financial and emotional situation. The decline was gradual and relentless. First, they lost the small house they had managed to buy with boxing earnings, then moved to a shack on the outskirts of Manila, and finally, when their only son, Bayani, was diagnosed with a serious heart condition requiring surgery, the marriage finally succumbed to the weight of circumstances, with Ligaya taking the boy to live with her parents in Cebu, where she believed they would have a better chance of getting medical help. Upon returning to his mansion in Forbes Park, that night, Manny couldn't get the encounter out of his head. The images of Eduardo, his thin and scarred body, contrasting with memories of the strong and determined athlete he had faced in the past, haunted his thoughts. Sitting in his luxurious office, surrounded by trophies, belts, and recognitions, Pacquiao felt a growing discomfort, a feeling that his success was somehow partially built on the ruins of careers of men like Eduardo Marasigan. For hours, Manny sifted through old files and repeatedly watched the recording of that controversial fight. With the trained eye of a veteran and the wisdom of years in the sport, he could now clearly see what he hadn't realized at the time. Eduardo had actually won that bout. The realization hit him hard. His meteoric trajectory had begun with an injustice. And while he accumulated millions and worldwide glory, the man who should have been the winner that night was sleeping under an overpass. The fault wasn't his for the judge's errors, but the responsibility to do something about it. Now that he knew the truth, certainly was. Josephine, his wife of more than 20 years and confidant in all important decisions, found him still awake. In the early hours of the morning, studying old newspaper clippings and videos of the fight with Eduardo, she knew that expression on her husband's face, the silent determination that preceded major changes in his life. Without need for many words, Manny shared the previous night's encounter and his conflicting feelings about his former rival's fate. Josephine listened with the understanding of someone who had accompanied the complete journey of a man who never forgot his humble origins in General Santos City, and suggested that helping Eduardo should not be seen as charity, but as a correction of destiny's course, an opportunity to balance the scales that had unfairly tilted to one side. The next morning, Manny convened a meeting with his political team, who immediately expressed severe concerns about his intentions. Carlos Mendoza, his chief strategist, was emphatic. "Senator, with all due respect, we're less than a year from elections. Publicly associating yourself with a homeless person, however noble your intention, could be interpreted as political opportunism. Additionally, there's the risk of creating a precedent. You can't help all ex-boxers in difficulty in the Philippines." Antonio Rivera, his campaign director, was even more direct. "If you proceed with this idea, 3 of our main donors have already indicated they'll withdraw their support. They don't want to see your name associated with this kind of controversial charity. And I have information that the opposition is already preparing a narrative about how you're buying votes from the poor with performative gestures." The tension in the room was palpable as other advisors agreed, citing potential negative headlines and questions about his priorities as a legislator. Manny listened patiently to each argument, his impassive face not revealing the inner storm he felt. When everyone had finished speaking, he slowly stood up and walked to his office window, watching Manila wake up below. "I understand all your concerns. They're valid from a political standpoint, but there are moments when a man must decide what kind of person he wants to be, not just what kind of politician. If I turn my back on someone I personally know who needs help, just out of fear of how it will look, what example am I setting? What message am I sending about our values as Filipinos?" Turning to face his team, he concluded, "If any of you can't continue working with me because of this decision, I'll understand. But I will help Eduardo Marasigan, with or without your approval, with or without the donors who abandon me because of it. Some things are more important than politics." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Antonio Rivera closing his laptop and leaving the room without a word, the first, but not the last team member who would choose to abandon ship in the weeks that followed. The transition wasn't easy for Eduardo. His first days at the training center were marked by curious looks and whispers from young fighters and staff who questioned the presence of this apparently broken man with no formal credentials. Who is this old man? Why is he here? The questions weren't asked directly, but Eduardo could feel them in the suspicious glances and interrupted conversations when he entered a room. A group of young boxers, led by Dante Villanueva, a talented 22-year-old middleweight with an impressive string of victories, was particularly vocal in their contempt, making audible comments about homeless people and political favors when Eduardo passed by. Installed in a small functional apartment at the back of the sports complex, he spent hours observing the training sessions, still uncomfortable assuming any position of authority. His body, accustomed to the harshness of the streets, found the comfort of a real bed and regular meals strange, while his mind struggled against the persistent feeling that he didn't deserve this new chance. Nights were frequently spent sleepless, tormented by nightmares where he returned to life under the overpass, discovering that everything had been just a cruel dream. On several occasions, Eduardo almost gave up, tempted to simply disappear before the inevitable moment when everyone would realize he was a fraud, a failed fighter trying to pass as a coach. Rizal Domingo, the center's head coach and Manny's former sparring partner, received clear instructions to integrate Eduardo into the technical team, recognizing the value his experience could bring. With patience characteristic of true masters, Rizal began involving Eduardo in small tasks, holding punching bags, timing rounds, organizing equipment. In the first 6 weeks, progress was painfully slow. Eduardo remained withdrawn, speaking only when directly approached, his contributions limited to mechanical tasks that required little interaction. Rizal observed patiently, understanding that regaining confidence after years of marginalization wouldn't happen overnight. It was only in the 3rd month that the first signs of change began to appear. During a sparring session between Dante, the boxer who most openly despised Eduardo, and a significantly weaker opponent, something changed. Dante was clearly abusing his superiority, humiliating his adversary with unnecessarily hard blows and verbal provocations. When Rizal was briefly called away to answer a phone call, leaving the session unsupervised, Eduardo found himself in a dilemma: remain silent as he had done until then, or intervene. Something inside him, perhaps the same spirit that had taken him to the rings decades ago, made him step into the space between the fighters and interrupt the sparring. With a precise demonstration of technique that surprised everyone, Eduardo instantly gained the respect of the young boxers, transforming his position at the center from a marginal figure to a respected mentor. That moment marked the real beginning of his reintegration, but the path to being fully accepted as part of the technical team would still be long and full of obstacles. News of Eduardo's presence at the center spread gradually in Manila's boxing circles. As his confidence grew each week, Manny discreetly arranged for Ligaya and Bayani to come from Cebu to Manila. The family reunion was deeply emotional, marked by the painful contrast between adolescent Bayani, visibly debilitated by his heart condition, and the memory of the healthy boy Eduardo remembered from 2 years before. Doctors confirmed the need for complex surgery, but offered hope of complete recovery, a procedure that would be covered by Eduardo's new health plan, a detail Manny ensured without fanfare. Ligaya's adaptation to the new environment was initially difficult, laden with distrust about the true intentions behind the sudden help. However, as she observed Eduardo gradually regain his dignity and purpose through his work at the center, her own reservations began to diminish. 4 months into their new life, Eduardo was no longer seen as a charity case, but as a valuable member of the technical team, his presence increasingly requested by young fighters who recognized the unique value of his experience. Over time, Ligaya also found her place in the community, offering her culinary knowledge in the center's kitchen, where her traditional recipes from Cebu quickly became favorites among the young athletes, providing her with a new sense of value and contribution. One afternoon, while supervising training, Eduardo was surprised by the arrival of a familiar figure, Ernesto Villar, a former boxing promoter who had managed his career during the period of decline after his defeat to Manny. The initially tense encounter evolved into a frank conversation when Ernesto admitted he had prioritized quick profits over Eduardo's well-being, encouraging him to continue fighting even knowing the severity of his eye injury. "I knew about your eye, Eduardo," Ernesto confessed, the arrogance of years past replaced by genuine remorse. "The doctor showed me the exams after the fight with Pacquiao. But you were my golden goose, and I didn't want to lose the investment." As they talked, Manny arrived at the center for one of his regular visits, finding the two men in a conversation laden with emotion and belated acknowledgments. Upon seeing the senator, Ernesto initially tried to adopt a defensive posture, fearing reprimands for his past treatment of Eduardo. To his surprise, Manny greeted him with respect, recognizing that they had all been products of an imperfect sports system that frequently sacrificed athletes' well-being in the name of spectacle and profit. A system that he himself, now in a position of influence, worked to reform through his political action and investments in training centers like that one. What began as a potentially tense encounter evolved into a productive discussion about the future of Filipino boxing, with Ernesto eventually offering his contacts and experience to organize a benefit exhibition that would help finance improvements to the center and assistance programs for ex-boxers in difficulty. This unlikely collaboration symbolized how old rivalries and resentments could be transformed into constructive partnerships when the common good became the priority. The conversation was interrupted by the excited arrival of Bayani, who, despite his limited physical condition, had discovered a passion for photography, documenting the daily life of the center with a sensitivity that impressed everyone who saw his images. The day of Bayani's surgery arrived with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The family arrived early at the medical center Manila, where a team of specialists led by Dr. Ramon Tolentino, one of the country's most respected cardiologists, waited to perform the complex procedure that could change the course of the teenager's life. Eduardo, normally reserved in his displays of emotion, couldn't contain his tears as he embraced his son before he was taken to the operating room, whispering words of encouragement that reflected the same phrases he used to repeat to himself before entering the ring in his glory days. The hours of waiting seemed endless for Eduardo and Ligaya, sitting side by side in the hospital waiting room, silently rebuilding the bridge of communication that years of hardship and separation had damaged. To the couple's surprise, Rizal Domingo appeared accompanied by several young boxers from the training center, including the formerly hostile Dante Villanueva and the promising Jaime Reyes, all wearing improvised t-shirts with the words Team Bayani. Shortly after, Ernesto Villar arrived bringing coffee and food for everyone, demonstrating a caring facet that Eduardo had never witnessed during his professional years. The most surprising moment, however, occurred when Manny Pacquiao discreetly entered the waiting room, not as the senator or celebrity, but as a man concerned about a child's well-being. Without fanfare or photographers, he sat beside Eduardo and Ligaya, sharing stories of overcoming and hope, transforming the atmosphere of anxiety into an environment of possibilities and future. His presence, more than any specific word, conveyed a powerful message. No one is alone in their most difficult struggles, not even those apparently forgotten by society. After almost 7 hours of procedure, Dr. Tolentino finally appeared in the waiting room with a serene expression that immediately relieved the accumulated tension. The surgery had been successful, although the path to complete recovery would be long and would require patience. The doctor explained the next steps in detail, emphasizing the importance of regular follow-up and a calm environment for Bayani's recovery. When Eduardo timidly asked about the costs of post-operative treatment, Dr. Tolentino smiled gently, informing him that everything was being covered by the hospital's medical assistance program, another discreet arrangement made by Manny without fanfare or expectation of public recognition. The following days were marked by small victories in Bayani's recovery, each celebrated as a significant triumph by the family and the training center community that had adopted the teenager as one of their members. A week after the surgery, when the young man finally received authorization to return home, a small entourage awaited him at the hospital entrance, Not only his parents and close friends, but also reporters and cameras, anonymously alerted about the extraordinary story of generosity that had unfolded away from the media spotlight. The story of the unlikely connection between Manny Pacquiao and Eduardo Marasigan quickly captured the Filipino public imagination. What began as a local report in Manila transformed into a national phenomenon when videos of Eduardo's interview, speaking with moving honesty about his journey from the streets to the training center, went viral on social media. The impact was amplified when the media discovered that Manny's support had cost him politically. The departure of important campaign financiers and the abandonment of longtime advisors revealed that the decision to help his former rival had not been taken lightly. The story touched a sensitive nerve in Filipino society, where boxing had long served as a metaphor for the population's daily struggle against seemingly insurmountable adversities. In a country where athletes frequently emerge from extreme poverty for moments of glory, only to return to anonymity and difficulties after their careers ended, Eduardo's case represented both an indictment of the system and a reason for hope. Public support for Manny, which had initially decreased due to his advisors' concerns, shot up to record levels, with polls showing a 23% increase in his approval, a powerful lesson on how authenticity and integrity still resonated with voters, even against the predictions of political strategists. The true catalyst for institutional changes came when Manny, inspired by both public support and ongoing conversations with Eduardo about the systemic failures in Filipino boxing, presented a comprehensive legislative proposal to the Senate. The Professional Athletes Protection and Development Act, informally nicknamed the Marasigan Law by the press, proposed the creation of a national fund for continued medical assistance, professional requalification programs, and dignified retirement for high-performance athletes. The legislation also required promoters and sports associations to contribute a percentage of their profits to this fund, as well as establishing minimum standards of safety and protection for active athletes. While the bill was being processed, in the Filipino Congress, the example of the training center in Manila inspired similar initiatives in other provinces. In Cebu, a consortium of local businessmen, motivated by Eduardo's story, financed the renovation of an old boxing gym, transforming it into a community center with specific programs for retired boxers. In Davao, the municipal government implemented a pilot program offering jobs in public parks and sports facilities for former athletes in difficulty. Most surprising was in Zamboanga del Sur, Eduardo's home province, where a small academy was inaugurated bearing his name, specifically dedicated to identifying local talents who, like him years ago, might go unnoticed by the media centralized. In Manila, international repercussions were not slow to arrive. The World Boxing Council recognized the pioneering efforts in the Philippines during its annual Congress, establishing a special committee to study the implementation of similar programs in other countries. The story of Eduardo and Manny was presented as a case study at a UNESCO conference on sport and social development, highlighting how individual initiatives could catalyze structural changes. An ESPN special report on Eduardo's life, from his rise as Eagle Marasigan to his current position as a mentor and symbol of resilience, attracted global attention to the issue of post-career athletes transcending cultural and geographical boundaries. While the impact continued to expand in ever-widening circles, Manny and Eduardo remained firmly focused on the daily work at the training center in Manila. For them, each young boxer guided, each former athlete reintegrated into society with dignity, each family kept together despite difficulties, represented a more significant victory than any world title or international recognition. What had begun as a casual encounter under an overpass was gradually transforming into a movement that challenged decades of institutional neglect and proved that even in the most flawed systems, individual compassion could serve as a catalyst for profound structural changes. 18 months after the encounter under the Bonifacio overpass, Eduardo Marasigan was no longer just an instructor at the training center, but its technical director, responsible for supervising the development of more than 50 young boxers and coordinating a team of 8 coaches. The transformation in his life was evident not only in his physical posture and renewed confidence, but also in the network of professional relationships he had built. The program he developed, combining traditional boxing techniques with an emphasis on financial education and career planning, had become a model studied and replicated by academies throughout the country. His knowledge, previously considered obsolete, was now actively sought by a new generation of fighters who recognized the value of learning from someone who had experienced all aspects of the sport, from glory to fall, and finally to redemption. The Thai Marasigan law, after intense debates and modifications, had finally been approved by the Filipino Congress and sanctioned by the President. Implementation began with a pilot project in 3 sports: boxing, basketball, and athletics, with plans for gradual expansion to cover all Olympic modalities in the following 5 years. The first beneficiaries included dozens of former boxers who, like Eduardo, had been forgotten by the system after their careers ended. The legislation not only provided financial and medical support, but also established mentorship programs that allowed these veterans to transmit their knowledge to new athletes, creating a virtuous cycle of support and development that transcended generations. The true innovation of the law, however, was in its preventive character. Active athletes now received mandatory guidance on financial management and preparation for post-competition life, addressing vulnerabilities before they transformed into crises. Bayani, fully recovered from his heart surgery, had become a young photographer whose work was beginning to be recognized beyond Filipino borders. His first solo exhibition, Fighter's Heart, a visual essay documenting the journey of young boxers from the training center, had been acquired by a gallery in Singapore and subsequently exhibited in Tokyo. His unique perspective, combining the intimacy of someone who grew up in the boxing environment with the sensitivity of someone who deeply knew human fragility due to his own medical condition, produced images of rare emotional depth. Ironically, the boy who had once been prevented from practicing any sport due to his heart condition was now contributing more to Filipino boxing through his lenses than many managed inside the rings. Ligaya and Eduardo had renewed their marriage vows in a small ceremony at the training center, symbolizing not only the reconstruction of their personal relationship, but also the philosophy of second chances that now defined their lives. Ligaya, who had initially been reluctant to believe in the sustainability of the new life, now directed the center's nutritional program, having completed a technical course in sports nutrition. Her contribution went beyond balanced meals. She had created an environment of emotional support that many of the young athletes, often away from their families in distant provinces, described as a piece of home. The couple, whose union had almost been destroyed by adversity, now served as a living example of resilience for an entire community. The relationship between Manny and Eduardo had evolved into a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared vision. The power divisions that would normally characterize the dynamic between benefactor and beneficiary had been replaced by an honest recognition of the unique contributions that each brought to their common mission. Manny provided the platform, visibility, and resources that made the work possible on a large scale. Eduardo offered the authenticity, lived experience, and technical knowledge that ensured that the initiatives remained truly connected to the athletes' needs. In one of their frequent meetings to discuss the future of the program, Manny had confided to Eduardo, "You think I changed your life, but the truth is you changed mine. Before, I donated money to causes. Now, I understand that real change requires more than resources. It requires constant presence and personal commitment." On a sunny Sunday morning, exactly 2 years after the encounter that had transformed so many lives, a special ceremony was held at the newly inaugurated National Sports Complex in Manila. The event marked the official launch of the National Network of Training and Reintegration Centers, an interconnected system of facilities in 7 different provinces, all modeled after the original pilot project. The audience included everyone from high government officials and sports celebrities to dozens of former athletes in various stages of professional reintegration. At the center of the stage, side by side, were Manny Pacquiao and Eduardo Marasigan. No, longer as senator and former homeless person, nor as world champion and forgotten boxer, but as equal partners in a journey of social transformation that had surpassed all initial expectations. The opening speech was brief, with Eduardo speaking without prepared notes, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had lived. Every word he pronounced. The true championship is not won under spotlights but in the shadows, when no one is watching. It is earned in the daily resistance against despair, in the refusal to remain down after each fall, in the willingness to extend a hand to others even when your own resources seem insufficient. As he concluded his words, a huge canvas was removed from the main entrance of the complex, revealing a photographic mosaic created by Bayani. Thousands of images of Filipino boxers, famous and unknown, active and retired, victorious and forgotten, all intertwined to form the silhouette of two hands meeting, one extended to help, the other reaching upward. Below, a simple inscription: "The encounter that changed a nation." That powerful image captured the essence of what had begun as a moment of individual compassion and transformed into a national movement. As he observed the emotional reactions of the crowd, Eduardo silently reflected on the extraordinary path he had traveled, from the peak as a young boxing promise to extreme degradation under an overpass, and finally to his current position as a symbol of resilience and agent of change. No champion's belt, no million-dollar purse could compare to the satisfaction of seeing his own fall serve as the foundation for a system that now protected hundreds of athletes from the fate he had faced. The true victory, he now understood, was not in never falling, but in transforming each fall into an opportunity to lift others up along with oneself. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to our channel.